Hello and
Hi.
welcome, ye merry folk, to the Virtual Renaissance Faire. This morning we are up bright and early, or at least up early, to talk about making your writing more fantastic in both the fantastical and in the awesome sense. I am Morgan Hazelwood. I am an unpublished fantasy writer, blogger, vlogger, podcaster, social media addict, whatever. And this is my co-host, Natalie. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Natalie Locke. I am a jester of sorts, but jesters work at night, so hence this. Uh, I am an unpublished contemporary writer. Contemporary women's fiction, contemporary sci-fi is the newest venture because why not? It's okay. And I have a little mini me running around right now.
Hello. So in the chat, I see that we have the Virtual Renaissance Writing Renaissance Faire, Steffi Faye, and Amber Craft. Good morning, fellow morning people. I am not one of you, but I am here. um, so let's talk about making your writing more fantastic. When we write, it's very easy to make modern idioms, modern language, and that sort of thing bleed through to our writing. And then we read it and it reads as if it was a modern person back in time, which works if you're writing Outlander, but not for many fantasy stories. However, when people write fantasy, there tends to be, especially in our culture, a tendency to make the language sound like their idea of an old Bible, with the these and the thous and the ye, etc. And people don't necessarily use that correctly. And also, it harkens back to a particular time in English history. And if your fantasy world isn't necessarily of British or United Kingdom descent, that very well might not be what you want to do. That's not the mood you want to set. That's not necessarily the language you want to use. So, any thoughts,
So
Natalie?
Morgan, yeah, I was
Yes.
gonna say, so is one of the first questions a writer should ask, like when they're writing a Renaissance theme, is even if it's a fantasy that is not Eastern, Europe, on Western European. There we go. I was like, wait a second.
There we go.
So what is like the first question they should ask about their world? What is the answer they need to find out before they start broaching the how the people are going to talk conversation?
If you're doing like a fantasy version of the War of Roses or something like that, then yeah, you're probably going to have a little more of that. But if a lot of people, when they write fantasy, take an actual true historical period and just kind of wiggle it a little. And if you do that, you want to look at that time period of that place and that sort of language there. If you're in Istanbul, before it becomes,
Constantinople.
after it becomes Constantinople, which way does it go? I forgot. Long time ago. Right. So anyway, so and I think Natalie had a rant for us on how people misuse thee, thys, and thous.
Oh wait, when I think I know what you're talking about, but that might have not been me.
Okay,
But
that's
I would totally steal it because the wasn't it like sarcastic comment where they blended together, or did I might have messaged that to you on Facebook?
yeah.
Blending together. It's been 2 weeks. Last week was 36 hours. I didn't participate in 36 hours, but either way.
Yeah.
But
So,
Stephanie Faye brought up Steffi Faye. Sorry, I didn't mean to put an N in there. She said, "Hear ye, thy language is not fitting for your fantasy."
and remember that thy is the intimate version, you is the formal version. And I think a lot of times writers trying to sound old-fashioned flip those, and they use you for the casual and thy for the formal, because it sounds so strange to our ear. So it sounds like it would be the more formal version, and that's not necessarily what you want to do. So I like to write fantasy that's not based on Earth, and I try to pick names and cultural backgrounds that are different touchstones, so it doesn't scream, I am of European descent, blah, blah, blah. Like so many of them do. When you see fantasy, what do you assume? Ren Faire level technology, Ren Faire language, etc. And although this is the Virtual Writing Renaissance Faire, that's not what I write. I have washing machines and stuff like that. And so a lot of times establishing the time period and the tech period is something you're going to want to do in the first chapter, especially if it's not default fantasy. And you want to make sure that you're not doing, I mean, it's totally fine if you want to do default fantasy. Just know that there are tropes that come with that and a lot of baggage that comes with that. And if you want to differentiate, a lot of people are looking for fantasy that's new and exciting worlds, new and exciting magic systems, and just not retold versions
Something
of
they
what
haven't seen before.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Oh, it's already plugged in. Then is there any, I hate to use it, I can't think of another way to call it, but is there any gold standard that people should research into of like that has great language? Like, I mean, Canterbury Tales, but even that's hard to read, because then you run into the situation of what is being said is harder to read on paper, because you're trying to stay so true to the times then.
Yeah. So it can be hard. It really can. I actually have a chart of words I replaced in my writing to more modern words in terms of phrase that I replaced with other words and phrases. So let me go ahead and share that for you. Share screen. Chrome tab.
You're speaking my language. I love charts and graphs and Excel.
Charts are the best. So this was a chart I made, also talking about filler words, because I use a lot of filler words. But these are suggestions of words you can use to make it sound less necessarily modern. Other things you're going to want to avoid are things like, okay, totally, for sure. Okay, you're not a valley girl, probably. If you are, more power to you. But you definitely want to try to avoid. So if we look at this on my chart, on the list of too many of these on the left, and then on the right is try these. So instead of I just can't do that, I simply couldn't, or I only wanted to, or I merely. You can replace the word can with may. Harkening back to Mother May is asking permission. Ken is asking if you could. I don't want to be that naggy teacher who says, that's not what you said.
My father did this to me growing up, and I didn't understand what he was saying when he went, I don't know, can you? Until I was in my 20s, because it was never explained to me. It was just the sarcasm.
Wow, that's rude. Like, he didn't explain.
No, I never got an explanation.
My mother would look at me and say, you've got the dishes. And I'm like, what about her? Pointing at my sister. And she'd be like, that was a plural you. Because my mom's a English major librarian. And so that's how she rolls.
I love that. So one thing I'm noticing on this chart Which, by the way, if anybody's watching on their phone, if you pull up your laptop later and pull this up, you can see it much better. But I am a big fan of, I mean, even though it's fantasy, but it's also not fantasy, but The Princess Bride. And there's a certain famous line in The Princess Bride of "as you wish." And I'm noticing wish is nowhere having a reference in the semblance. Did they not wish back in fantasy?
Oh, I have wish in the remove, but I think it depends on the context and how you're using it. So
okay, you're about to tear my heart real deep there.
Yeah, yeah. Like,
so as then, like, what context are we talking about with "as you wish" then?
I think when you're talking about true dreams or politeness, or that sort of thing, it definitely fits in. But there are contexts of, like, I don't have an example in front of me, unfortunately.
It's okay. I sprung this one on you.
So yeah.
Yeah.
But for those of you who are trouble seeing this visual, I'm going to go ahead and read most of the suggestions to you.
Oh yeah, let's go for it.
Instead of give, endow.
Now we're sounding like we're going very
right.
A certain type of
this right. But it's also less modern sounding terms. And this is just a suggestion, and clearly do your research and go from there. Instead of want, there's like or prefer. Instead of try, endeavor to do something. Instead of look at something, you regard their face. Instead of looking for, you might seek something. Instead of waiting for, await. Instead of given, you could yield. And some of that is just more accurate language. You know how they say ignore the, skip the adverbs and use a more powerful, more precise verb choice. A lot of that, of this chart, is actually that. Instead of give, you could be gifting someone something, or bestowing, sending it to them, providing it to them, or offering it to them. Instead of a bit, which is one of my favorite hedge words that is all over my writing because I hedge a lot, you could use slightly, which is an ly, it's an adverb, and I do try to cut back, but it's just a way to vary up your language as well if you're finding yourself using these words repeatedly. Instead of pretty as a modifier, not as an adjective, but you could use quite, fairly, or rather. Like, this was pretty hard. It was quite hard.
I like that difference of recognizing there's the adjective form of verbs, there's the modifier, because the English language, we like to confuse people, and we like to make nouns into verbs sometimes, and so we got to be aware of the word placement in the sentence and the structure.
Context matters.
What was that?
Context always matters.
Yes.
So, yeah, moving on, instead of a lot, you could use fair or much or considerably.
I read that as fair much, and I'm like, I've never heard of fair much.
It was a fair amount of olives, or depending on this, I like you much, or it was a considerable amount of clothing. Speaking of which, in pre-industrial society, people are going to have fewer changes of clothes. They are going to rewear stuff. They are going to wash the under layers and not the outer layers as much. So definitely, when they're packing for a trip, if you don't have washing machines and cheap fashion, they're not going to have that many clothes. They're going to have 3 or 4 changes of clothes, with one of those being their Sunday best, and their sleep robes might be their undergarments. So just be aware that clothing is expensive until you have looms and sewing machines. It's very, very work intensive to both make the cloth and form the cloth. So,
but I feel like clothing back then would last longer than our clothes today, but also because it's not being washed as much. And
it's thicker and heavier.
Yes,
cotton
heavier.
Wasn't that widespread until later. I mean, it's a fantasy world. You can do whatever you want.
I mean, you could invent cotton and bring it in and everything, but I think it's still smart, even though you're doing a fantasy, to slightly treat it like historical, a historical novel, just enough to like get the language down and stuff of what's inspiring you, and then throw in the random crazy elements that make it not historical.
Exactly. Have it based in things that make sense. They say with fantasy that you have your one big concept that the world revolves around, but everything else needs to derive from that or derive from reality. Otherwise, you're just going to confuse your reader, and they're going to be like, wait, what? Yeah. And anytime your reader is like, wait, what? They are thrown out of the novel, and that could be a point where they put it down and don't finish it. So you don't want to
like, we can only suspend disbelief for so long. And it's in movies when, like, sometimes the fourth wall can be broken, but other times you're like, why did this happen? Like, I was sucked into your movie, but now I realize there's an entire camera crew behind the camera, and like this was established.
Right. So I'm almost done with this chart. Let's see if we think of anything else. But I
thought of a word that I don't think I see. But I'm going to hold on to it until you finish, just to make sure that I'm not crazy here.
Getting something, maybe you're becoming or growing or obtaining or receiving something or arranging something. So obviously these are different instances based on what you're actually doing. But just get is just such an overused word, and there's so many other options you can use. But you don't want to sit at the thesaurus the entire time you're writing. So I understand that. Instead of the word really, you might want to go with truly or actually or surely, honestly, certainly. Obviously, these are all adverbs. You want to minimize those, but you don't want to eliminate them. Just because, Stephen King has a vendetta against adverbs doesn't mean they're the worst things in the world. People talk with them, definitely. But sometimes if you're going to have to rearrange an entire sentence and make it clunky to avoid the use of an adverb, you're probably doing the wrong thing. You want to use them sparingly, but effectively. And finally, we have believe or think. Sometimes you want to deem something.
Deem it necessary.
Exactly. That sort of thing. So these are just suggestions, and these are things that I used in one of my stories just to try and get that modern knack out a little. Another thing that I think a lot of people forget about is idioms. So sharp as a tack, there are a lot of idioms that speak to modern things like trains and just things that don't necessarily exist in your world. Do they have an ocean?
Even calling someone cuckoo, even though that's kind of more early 1900s, I would say, for our present culture, would that even be a comment about somebody, or lost your marbles and stuff? Like, those wouldn't probably exist in a fantasy unless you're creating a mixture.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And you also have to think about where the idiom comes from. And so if your world doesn't have the things in it, you're gonna want to use a different idiom. Plus, idioms are fun to invent. You can take, instead of the early bird catches the worm, and make your own version based on the animals and the culture you're in. I write a lot about exploring faith with imaginary religions. And so I have to remember not to reference Adam and Eve or, the devil, because that's not what exists in my world. And so when people are cursing, they're not going to say damn it, because they don't believe in a hell sort of thing. And so even my curses are totally made up. But one of the
actually
things
that can be more fun, and then it can help you not cuss in real life if you go with your fantasy cuss words. It's fun.
Right. And then there are things that are historic but don't seem like they are, that would throw characters out of the story. I think Neil Gaiman has a rant about how Tiffany doesn't sound historical to our modern ears, but Tiffany is based on a noise of trumpeting or drumming or something like that, and was very much a period name back in the day. But when people hear it in a historic context, they're going to be like, no. And so it's up to you if you want to lean on that historic reality or modify it in order to avoid throwing people out of the story.
J.D. Estrada, writer, we're giving him flashbacks of researching Just in his manuscript for the first time. I've yet to do that, but I'm sure it's in there. Of course, mine's contemporary, but I'm still using it a bit too much. But even reading Dude in historical, yeah. Even reading Dude in historical novels, it just felt off. Like, and it kind of ties into even Tiffany would like make sense in a historical, but because we've changed the meaning and it doesn't mean what it used to so long, having present day people read it as a historical, it would take them away from it. It would break that fourth wall, or whatever, the wall.
So definitely things to think about. You want to make sure that you're not ruining the story, but you don't want to fall into the default fantasy tropes unless it's a decision. If you decide that's what you want to do, that's fine.
So what tropes are we talking about here? Because me being new to writing, I'm always like in these, I hear the tropes and I know them when I hear them, but actually knowing what's specific to fantasy, what's specific to contemporary sci-fi, that's the part that takes me apart. So can you think of any tropes off the top of your head? Because apparently it's my thing to put you on the spot.
A lot of our fantasy we like to use Celtic tropes. We like to, with their version of the fairy or the Tuatha De Danann and the putting out saucers of milk and the way that the Fae world intersects with the human world a lot of times. Sometimes there's changelings and that sort of thing. And it's just very much based on the British Isles version of fantasy. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's also things straight out of D&D manuals where you use classic spells, and the magic works almost like, well, I mean, it's really hard to have a magic system that works differently, that doesn't feel like it's just different in order to be different, because there's clerical magic, there's, nature magic, there's spellbook magic, there's innate magic. So all of these types of magic are in your classic role-playing game. And so a lot of people just use those, and that's totally fine, but it has to be a decision rather than just something you end up doing. And a lot
of, if you end up doing it, I feel like you're not going to realize what the rules you created for your world are, and then you're not going to follow those rules, and then that's what's going to take the reader out later, is because you didn't set a regiment, I guess you could say. And I would think a magic system would even play a part with the speech. Like, you can't have a magic system that uses common day language, like fire. Really? In my opinion. But I'm sure some writer out there has been able to finagle the world a little bit. But you have this like almost Canterbury Tales, Old English language, and modern day someone shoots steel out of their arms and still hasn't been created yet.
Monarchies that work like the British one did.
Yes.
The whole Game of Thrones and that sort of thing. I mean, Game of Thrones literally was based on the War of Roses in England. And so if you're using that, recognize it and own it. But, you know, it's okay to mix different things. One of my favorite quotes, I don't know who actually said it, but is if you steal from one or two places, that is plagiarism. If you steal from everywhere, that's research.
I love that line. So one point that
one caveat. Can I caveat that real quick? If you're taking from a culture that is not your own, do respect it, do understand, and don't just take the trappings without really understanding what's beneath it. There are ways to do it right and ways to do it wrong. And if you're leaning heavily on a particular culture, definitely have a sensitivity reader, because there may be nuances that you are not innately familiar with because it's just not a native culture to you. And so there's nuances that might have escaped you, and you might be using something in a way that's offensive to people from that
especially if you're borrowing some of their language. Like the only language that I've researched enough to at least order food in it is German, and there's High German and Low German, and then there's like the personal, and then the formal and the informal, and whereas like my neighbor who was the same age with me, I was using the formal with her, and she's like, you don't have to, stop it, we're the same age. And I was like, okay. But like having that knowledge when if you're borrowing language from established languages. I can't think of words right now. This is bad.
So for people who are not watching, we are sharing a banner for the event. It says, "The throne belongs to no queen. The throne belongs to no queen." So, okay. Enough
with
that,
Haley did bring in, of course, she's in the Virtual Writing Renaissance Faire YouTube, which the playlist is down below, if I remember correctly. Oh, let me scroll down. I hate it when I didn't mean to throw you out under the bus if you forgot. Okay. But there was an author recently who accidentally used ingredients for a potion from Zelda in his historical, completely non-fantasy Irish history. I don't think it's accidentally if it's like word for word, like this is the potion.
It might have just been in their back catalog in their brain. And so when they were coming up with stuff, it sounded right because it was the right mix. But then again, that doesn't mean that Zelda Breath of the Wild writers didn't take inspiration for their ingredients from traditional country nicknames for stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so, oh, Somebody, JD said they actually Googled it and just used the list as is. I believe that's what he was replying to. So, oh my goodness. He just didn't know how to Google and took the first entry. That is ridiculous. That is definitely ridiculous. So in the comments, JD chimed in, one of the tropes that we see a lot in fantasy is the overcomplicated names with 7 syllables, and then their nickname is 1 syllable, which I get if their name is super long. But a lot of fantasy, you'll end up with the trope of the lots of L's and vowels and long and flowy, or the apostrophes. There's a lot of apostrophes. And I think it comes from Dragon Riders of Pern, which came out in what, the 70s, the first ones, and in it shortens someone's name when they become a dragon rider, which is an interesting way to do it, but a lot of people have taken that trope and used it. Hello and welcome. We have Eva here with us as well. So let's see. JD points out that the word muggle did not first appear in Harry Potter, and it sounded odd in there at first. So that's definitely something interesting. I was unaware that muggle was being used as it was. So those are definitely some fantasy tropes that people just fall into. So we've talked about word choice. We've talked about idiom usage. We've talked about name selection. Ed in the comments asks, what are our thoughts on using suffixes or prefixes to indicate maiden names, parents, families, etc., and how to do this realistically? It depends on the culture you take it from. Obviously, there's the Scandinavian, I'm not sure which countries in Scandinavia do this, but there's you take the mother's name and you add daughter to the end, or son, or whatever the suffix is, and then you take like the person's first name and you add that to the end. I have stolen that in one of my fantasy worlds, but I think about the vowels and the letters and the word choices that we in our language associate with the feminine or the masculine or what have you, and decide if that's what you want to keep in your story, or if you want different tropes, like maybe guy names end with vowels and girl names end in consonants. And if you if you're coming up with a suffix or something, if your world is not derived from a Latin speaking language, for those who are unfamiliar, the Latin derived languages are French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and there's a 5th one. Can't think of it. French, Italian, Spanish. Anyway, if it's not a Romance language, think hard before you use a Latin derived prefix or suffix. We use them a lot in science. We use them a lot in English, but they aren't, if your world has no context for that, you shouldn't be using those. Or if you do use them, it should be a purposeful decision, like their language doesn't exist in our world, and this is the translation for how we would have said it, and that sort of thing. So so that's definitely. Ed has popped in to say Romanian is a Romance language as well. So thank you for that. remember that English is a Germanic language. We're derived from German, but after the Norman invasion, which the Normans were French, we stole a lot of stuff from the Romance languages, and a lot of the nobility used French things. And that's why we have beef and cow, and those two words don't sound alike at all, because the formal version was derived from French, where the common peasant people were using that Germanic derived language. So these are definitely things to think about when you're coming up with words, when you're coming up with worlds, is where are your people from and what sort of language are they going to be using? So let me just think for a moment. So going back to the question on suffixes and prefixes to indicate maiden names, maybe people are called after the town they came from. That's very common, especially historically. And originally, you know, calling someone someone's daughter or someone's son was just literally so you knew who they were. Oh, that's Ralph's son, George.
And that's how we got a lot of the last names that we have now, like Williamson, Johnson,
Robinson.
Yes. And then I know I watched a few of those, not to go too modern here, but a few of those CrossFit games, and some of the girls who are like the top CrossFit games is like Sigmund's daughter is her name.
Exactly. So. Yeah. So definitely things to think about. And maybe your world is matrilineal, in which case it follows the mother instead of patrilineal, like a lot of Western culture tends to be outside of Scandinavia. Or, you know, it can be, maybe marriage in your world isn't a permanent thing. Maybe it's a 7-year contract or something like that.
Ooh, you should have fun with this. I might write a fantasy at some point.
I love fantasy, and I love doing what ifs.
Yeah.
In the comments, JD also said, I mentioned the towns, but some people's names are literally the area of the town. Were they by the river, or were they by the hills, and that sort of thing? And I actually use that for my naming conventions for my towns as well. They're often named after the river they're next to, or the grove of trees nearby, and that sort of thing. Even long after the grove of trees was cut down, you know, you might have, you know, Oak's Edge or what have you. So those are definitely things to think about. Virtual Renaissance Faire says, my name means field of hay. In my family, one of the last names is Carter, and that just means it's a job-based one. They made wheels for carts and that sort of thing. Smith was the town blacksmith or silversmith or whatever. Carpenter, I think we can figure that one out. So some of the people are just called after what. So those are the predominant options for last names or what have you. Profession, where they came from, or their parental, on whichever side.
Yeah. Well, and then, like you said, weighing whether it's going to be a matriarchy or a patriarchy type influence. And I find that very interesting. Or you could even change it up, like sibling groups, or that's how they're identified. Like that.
Generationally.
I just came up with that. I don't even know if it's good. I'm sure someone can write it really well.
In some places, I've seen fantasy, or although it's more science fiction that I've seen this, in which children are raised in creches, And so all the babies from a generation are raised by, you know, their caretakers apart from their parents. And sometimes they know who their parents are and sometimes they don't.
It's like a group effort, like the whole, it takes a village, stands true.
Exactly. So I was asked if I had any examples of matriarchies in fantasy that I could suggest. I have a couple that come to mind of ones in which the woman ends up ruling, but I'm trying to think.
Yeah, like
Kushel's Dart, if you want to go. It's a little erotic, but it is a fantasy series by one moment. Let me look.
I can think of one, and I'm not sure if anybody knows this series, but it's like the Zoe Redbird series, and it's more contemporary urban fantasy. But she has witch and vampire. Ignore that. My husband's playing with toys right near me. Sorry if that song is copyrighted, but honey, wait. Okay. But Zoe Redbird series, it's witch based, and there's like a high priestess that deals with the elements and such. I'm gonna go on mute now.
Okay, Jacqueline Carey, that was the author. My bookshelves are ABC order, but it deals with a courtesan, and it's very explicit, so caveat there. And it's a little kinky, but it is a fantasy world, and it is based on France. It's set in an alternate version of our world, in which, like, Mary Magdalene and angels and stuff, it's things. But anyway, in the audience, Virtual Writing Renaissance Faire suggested Ash Princess by Laura Sebastian is a great YA matriarchal fantasy. I wanted to say Tamara Pierce, but her earlier writings are about the first female knight and that sort of thing. So
I love that, taking a male idea and then turning it into like a female was actually part of it. Really? You haven't been doing that for the past 2 minutes. I'm going on mute again.
And Grape Fry asked you House of Night.
Yes, House of Night. Thank you. I got that series, but I enjoyed it. It was kind of a read once for me type of thing, just because it was a mother and daughter author combo, and there was at times where it felt juvenile. I hate to say that because it has a negative connotation, and it still works. I mean, I still bought it and read it. They got my money.
Oh, I thought of another one, Tiger Burning Bright by Marion Zimmerman Bradley, Mercedes Lackey, and it was 3 people, I think. One moment, I can't remember the third author. Oh, and Andre Norton. So the masters of fantasy from like the 70s and 80s. It's about a matriarchy city-state that's being invaded, and each of the writers takes the queen mother and the princess and follows them. So it's a really good story. I highly recommend Tiger Burning Bright by Bradley, Lackey, and Norton. So let me pop that in the comments.
This is why I love our community, because it's like, I know this book. I can't remember the title, then someone else chimes in. Like, yes. Oh, by the way, this makeup is on purpose. If you notice, I haven't put effort in. So go in extension. It's on purpose. I'm a jester. I'm supposed. Oh wait, I got deep bridge in my nose. I just thought it would be fun to do this while we're talking.
Right. I'm a librarian's daughter. My sister just went back to library to get her master's in library science. So this comes very natural to me.
These are my people. This is my home.
I hear so many people talk about how genre fiction, sci-fi and fantasy is so many male writers and they struggle to find female writers. And I look at my bookshelves, which are like 70% women, and I read almost exclusively science fiction and fantasy and urban fantasy and what have you. And I'm just like, I don't know if it's the subgenres I prefer or the fact that, you know, once you find one writer you like, you get all the books by them. And so I end up with a lot of books by a few people. But my bookshelves are not as diverse as they could be, and they lean heavily towards women writers. So,
but sometimes it could be a marketing aspect where we don't see, we see more market for the men writers. So therefore it seems like there's not many women, when really it's just they weren't marketed as well. You are not getting makeup on your eyes. No, honey. That's where I draw the line. It's not because you're a boy, it's because you're 3. I promise you.
There's also an instance in which women writers, even if they're not writing YA, especially these days now that YA is so big, find their books put into the YA section. And YA fantasy, I would say, is pretty strongly dominated by women.
Yes. YA, I feel like is strongly dominated by women. But and I feel like YA actually has a strong presence on YouTube as well.
Definitely. And Twitter, social media in general, yes. I would say. Probably partially because of who's writing it, and partially because of the be where your audience is. Well, our audience is on social media, and so we feel that we should.
And if you're doing, like it was recommended, if you're doing YA, get on TikTok, because that's like the new thing, which I feel a little behind the curve on that. But I'm writing adult right now, so, but kind of, you gotta snag them while they're young. So I might have to do a YA to introduce kids, and then as they get older, they go, oh wait, she has adult books.
I've seen people when they do children and then adult, they'll use like their initials for one and they'll use their full name for the other, because they're like, I love my children readers. I don't want them to pick up this book. And so by differentiating the name at least slightly, you know what you're getting with the novel. I know Shannon McGuire, she does her urban fantasy under Shannon McGuire, and she does her zombie stuff under Mira Grant. So, but some people just do initials with the same last name, so it's easier, because in this day and age of social media, you want people who like your writing to find your other stuff, but you do want to make sure that their expectations are met. If people go in looking for fantasy and end up with a romance, they're going to give you 1-star reviews. If they go in looking for a romance and it's more fantasy, you've got to meet the reader's expectations, or they're going to 1-star you and pan you. And I know people hate putting themselves into a box, but if you improperly market, you might get a lot of clicks, but they're not going to be positive. So you want to find your audience for your story.
So do you think, you mentioned doing initials as you change genres and stuff. So do you think people should actually have different names for different genres?
I think if you don't mind the readers overlapping, it doesn't matter as much. But if you have children and then very explicit stuff, you're going to want at least, instead of Morgan Hazelwood for children and YA, M Hazelwood for like rude and crude and stuff I don't actually write.
The stuff that you hide underneath your mattress.
Exactly. Ed in the comments shared Briggs, Bujold, Andrews, Aaron, Bradley, Cooper, McGuire, Paxson, lots of good writing by women that can appeal to men and women both. Definitely.
Oh.
Lois Bujold looks like a soccer mom, and writes amazing space opera sci-fi, is the first winner of the Hugos for series. So, I mean, Marion Zimmerman Bradley does have problematic personality things we cannot gloss over, but was very institutional in getting, she wrote another planet that started off as fantasy during like their dark ages-y sort of thing with magic, and then they get refound by the spacefaring people, and so it gets into more sci-fi at that point in politics. So that's I think this is Susan B. Cooper for the Cooper. She's awesome. Shannon McGuire is my favorite writer. Patricia Briggs is my second favorite writer, so they're definitely in there. I'm not familiar with Paxson, but yeah. I'd also suggest for military espionage sci-fi Tanya Juff. So those are out there. Huff. Thank you. I know Tanya Huff.
You were just reading it off, like going, yeah, that's right, sure.
I did say I was unfamiliar with that writer. I'm familiar with Tanya Huff.
Yeah.
So yeah. But just I think we're at closing thoughts.
We're getting close, yes, definitely. And I'm almost look like a jester because I don't have a jester hat, so I'm improvising. Oh man, I wonder if I want to keep this on all day. I'm glad I didn't wear this earlier. My daughter had a friend over last night, and her dad came to pick her up, and I didn't want to answer the door like this, so poor Lisa. All right.
So I take it you're not friends with your friend, with your daughter's dad's.
No, my daughter's friend's dad, like I've been like 3 times. I was like, let's not pull out the red eyeshadow across the entire face and
Abigail, you look amazing.
Thank you. I'll have a finished look eventually. I'm trying to do the spike in the back with my hair. We're gonna go with that. I don't know. I'm gonna have fun with this. Hell, I might even just keep on changing it throughout the day.
No reason not to.
Yeah, why not? I just gotta remember that all the clothes are clean, even though I wore them for 2 hours.
This is an hour and a half, not an hour session. My bad.
I was just going with it. I'm like, yeah, sure. Well, we can keep it going because. Oh, okay. So I'm putting eyeshadow on my son because he won't leave me alone about it. It's fine. Here.
Okay. So we've talked about language. We've talked about idioms. We've talked about name choices.
And researching, which is grabbing from everything.
We've talked about authors we suggest. Let's see. Let me look at my notes and see what else.
I haven't thought of because I don't write fantasy.
Okay.
Yet. I don't want to say I never will because you never know.
Right.
I might. Hell, I didn't think I'd write sci-fi, and then I got a shower thought. So twice. But something that I have had a thought about is what constitutes as a fantasy, like because you brought up your fantasy is inspired like not earth-based, which to me sounds more sci-fi. So what makes a fantasy?
I mean, if you think about some of the stories you've read, I don't know if you read fantasy, but if they're not set in a particular place and there's magic and things around, there's no reason to assume it's on Earth.
True.
So basically, if it's not set in a particular place, in mine, I have 2 moons, so it's probably not Earth.
I'm having fun right now. Why not?
Definitely. I love it. I love it.
See, 2 moons makes me think of I might even, I'll make my eyebrows more pronounced. 2 moons makes me think of more sci-fi. as well. So
it just
and
on
I'm not
another
trying to
planet.
make you defend, because I know you write fantasy, so I'm not trying to
Right.
make you defend it, but if I think of myself as a brand new writer, which I am, but if I was to write fantasy, I feel like knowing your genre is the hardest part. And the best thing you can do is read, such as all the authors we just listed that would help guide anybody get to where they need to be. But it's just like what elements, and I think you touched on it already, of like, you know, it could be, would a lack of technology be an element, or should there be technology?
It depends what powers the technology. If the technology is run by magic, think Sword of Truth series. They have some technology that's run by magic. Then that would be fantasy. If there's explicit magic, it's some sort of fantasy, even if it's in a sci-fi world. That's actually what I'm writing for my NaNoWriMo. I'm mixing sci-fi and fantasy in space.
Yay.
And I'm gonna have like octopus aliens and tons of fun. But I think it harkens back to the quote that science and magic are sufficiently advanced. Technology is what's the quote? Is indistinguishable from magic. If you don't know how it works and it just works, it might as well be fantasy.
That's actually true.
Yeah. Fry mentioned that there's so much overlap between sci-fi and fantasy, which is completely true.
Yes.
They're both under the speculative fiction umbrella.
Yeah, where, I mean, really, it's artist, not artist, like,
and one could argue
artistic license.
Yeah, one could argue that sci-fi is fantasy in a futuristic setting.
You know, yeah, definitely. I wholeheartedly agree about it, because there is tropes that cross over between both, like a mentor.
Yeah. Okay, I have the full quote. It's from Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Clarke's first law. Because, I mean, 50 years ago, you could work on your car. These days, you got to hook it up and get it, the printout and all these other things. Yeah. And the further removed from being able to fix it yourself, the closer to it's a box, you turn it on, it does stuff.
That's what I think sometimes. My husband gets upset because he used to be a mechanic, and he's actually getting upset because more cars are technology based. Like now they can read your tire pressure, and he changed the tires and totally broke like 2 of them. So I can't read 2 of my tires now.
Yeah.
Thanks, honey.
Yeah. So that's definitely something to think about when you pick your setting, you know. If sci-fi is your version of fantasy, is you want to make sure that the language follows and that you're not using modern idioms and modern references. A lot of people like to write about the period they grew up in, so they can have all those cultural references and things.
Yeah.
So which is, I think, why we're falling a lot into more urban fantasy, so people can play with their childhoods, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, like, think of Stranger Things. Like, that was pretty much their childhood, and it's
exactly.
Which Stranger Things, I feel like, also crosses into the sci-fi realm too. It's like, it's hard to distinguish.
Yeah. Is it magic based or tech based? Is usually, although these days with there's steampunk and gas lamp, and the difference between steampunk and gas lamp is it steam powered, or is that same level of technology powered by magic? So those are sister subgenres, I would say. So Ed in the comments says that heroism and symbolism, magic that operates in a mystical or intuitive way rather than a world that is 100% logical and linear. exploring human nature by projecting qualities on the external world. Not always, not always. There's definitely some people who have written magic that's very formulaic, that you do X, Y, and Z, and you always get A or what have you. Which I think I'd like to see more of, actually. Making magic a recipe rather than a force of will. It's usually a force of will.
Yeah, it's usually like to me, there's always two power sources, ideas. There's the internal, with your interaction from pulling from the outside, or if you're born with it or something. And then there is the you have to have a specific magical item, and then that's how you get it. Whether it's, sometimes it's a ring, it's usually jewelry, actually.
Yeah.
Keep going. Yeah. And then sometimes it's a mixture of both.
Yeah.
Oh,
traditional fantasy very often has ley lines in which magic flows like rivers, and you can't see it without magic sight or whatever. So,
and this, it will affect your language, because is your magic verbal or is it non-verbal, and it's more gestures and stuff. So then you got to make sure, like, bending your elbow not like a T-Rex is probably not the language you want to describe while all right, either way, it's probably not the language you want to describe as you're building your world with the magic, with what's around the outside. So that, that's pretty much the saying of, you don't, that goes back to our idioms and stuff. Like, we're trying to make a contemporary reader understand this made up world set long ago. And so we need commonplace, like a reader knows what a tree looks like, but they may not know what this magical tree looks like with the twisting vines and stuff and how it moves. So being able to convey that language without saying it moves like a ribbon dancer. We may not have that, or not. Yes, sweetie.
I've seen Dance is Magic.
Yeah.
Where certain dances can raise power and stuff, but a lot of that harkens back to native dances and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So definitely
hopefully your research shows. Hopefully your research shows that I might do something. I'm gonna have fun with my hair later. But hopefully your research shows like what you can do. And it just definitely ties back to language, because at the end of the day, the way you're describing your world, the way you're describing the magic and everything, it's all back to the language. And so you want to make sure it's consistent throughout, and use that chart that you showed earlier of like, you want to use just
or your own.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. You could create your own language too, which I think that's a later panel.
There's otherwise known as conlang, constructed languages. Obviously, J.R.R. Tolkien is like the father of conlang,
and of describing everything.
And all the backstory. These days, I would recommend to J.R.R. Tolkien that he just publish his world building as a gaming setting, and let's as a secondary product, of course, because he definitely and I'd be like, let's leave that backstory in the player's handbook and just focus on the story here.
He's excited.
JP would like us to know that T-Rex spell would cast a meteor, which, I mean, too soon. It
took me a second. Oh, that's great. Like, I read it and I'm like, okay, cool, cast a spell, and then I went, and then like you reading it out loud, it clicked for me, and I'm like, yeah.
So that is one setting I don't often see. I don't often see dinosaurs as main characters as
that is true.
I have seen them as were-shifters in like were romance with dinosaurs.
So it kind of makes me think of so the Disney movie Meet the Robinsons. There's the hat that can like control the little mini hat that can control animals and stuff like that. And the bad guy goes back in time to grab a T-Rex to put a little hat on him and control him. And the T-Rex is stuck in a corner trying to grab the kid and can't. And he's like, I have a big head and little arms. I don't think this plan was thought out. And then his tail curls underneath the chin and goes, Master? And it's just hilarious and adorable. Sorry if you haven't seen the movie or it's been a while because
I'm sorry.
Disney
I have a thing I have to share about T-Rexes. The truth about T-Rexes is things that they thought were cousins of them were actually juvenile T-Rexes. And T-Rexes have proportional arms until they hit basically puberty, and then their arms stop growing.
Whoa.
Right? No wonder they're so cranky. They can't reach anything anymore.
I do. That itch you can't scratch.
Right? Their arms atrophy once they hit puberty, and it's very, very rough on them, and then they just rely on their teeth and go arr, just like that. I'm sure. So definitely when you're thinking about making a fantasy, think about where it is, when it is, and feel free to veer from reality as much as you want. Just make sure it's internally consistent.
Yeah, this is where a series Bible or a story Bible that people talk about, like this is where that's going to come in play. So if you're ever creating that thing, do a YouTube Google search because there's so many videos on it of how to create your Bible, because then that will save you from those situations that we were talking about earlier of, oh, I'll just throw this in just because. Well, just because doesn't become a rule. It's a rule to your reader, but it's not a rule to you, and it needs to be a rule to you as well. So you stay honest to it. I get luckily my son's playing in the makeup now. I don't care anymore.
Luckily, your reader does not know what order you wrote your story.
Exactly.
If you come up with a great idea, you can shoehorn it in and just make sure you set it up so it doesn't come as a surprise later on. Mm-hmm. I was writing my story. It has nothing at all to do with this, but I decided I want water dragons that are like puppies, kind of like totally inspired by Falcor from the Never-Ending Story. Yay! And I have a fantasy world, and I'm like, there is no reason they can't exist. I will just have them a side-by mention when somebody's talking about their quest to get to place B, It's like the water dragons led me here. And it's not on screen because they have nothing to do with this particular story in this world. But I have a fantasy world and I wanted them, and now they exist because it's my world. And
because artistic license.
Exactly. And who wouldn't want a water puppy dragon?
I would want one. I'm just imagining. I'm imagining like when they sneeze, like water comes out and stuff, like the little cute doggy puppy sneeze. Yes. Or oh god, there's so many ways you could do this. And then like maybe they're really like fluid movement in water, and then they get on land and it's like they don't know what to do if they're amphibious.
Right.
Oh, that would be so fun. See, this is where I wish I had the artistic skills, because then I would draw a little water puppy, as I will call it.
Right. Well, that's a totally different issue. I'm not a very visual imagination. I'm very conceptual. I know that they look like that, but I can't like visually see it. So I'm stuck doing Google image searches for like visuals. And sometimes I do that as a crib for describing characters and settings. I know what it is. And when I see it, I'm like, that's it. And then that helps me with my description. So, but that's a totally different subject that I'll be talking about tomorrow.
Yay!
I'm doing a Preptober video, and I'm doing world building tomorrow. So at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, right here, same bat channel, same bat place. after a dinner break after my sprint. So
yeah.
my sprint's at 5:00 tomorrow. But yeah. So
yes, the dog.
Do we have any questions in the audience about making your language more fantastical and things about that? I definitely want to open up
I think
to
your
questions.
chart is really like the best thing ever. Oh, the word that I did not see on your chart. Favor or favorable. And like I feel like that's like a big hitter in language. So how would that be in context?
I think that's not necessarily something a word you would replace with favorable.
Okay.
Although,
and I didn't see it as what it would replace. I guess if you said like, right. I like it, maybe I find it favorable, or I deem it favorable.
Yes. But one of the things I highly recommend is Etym Online. Etymology is the study of languages.
Yes. I actually took a class on that, etymology, and we started with Beowulf, then did Canterbury Tales, and then I forget what we did after that. But it was really fun.
Entomologies, bugs, etymologies, languages. So I go to Etym Online all the time. Let me pop that into the comments.
I'm sorry.
And that way you can find out the history of a word and when it was introduced and what the concepts were before that. So let's see. What were we just talking about? Favor?
Yes.
So my question is favorable come from the concept of giving someone your favor?
Yeah, and like a token.
Okay. So in the 1300s, favor was actually attractiveness, beauty, or charm. And it comes from the Old English of a favor, which is approval, praise, applause, or partiality, which is, I think, how we're mostly familiar with favor. And that's
I can see how it evolved from the 1300, because sometimes it's like the knight would give a rose to the woman, and she would give her handkerchief that was something more beautiful, that showing favor to that person through the trials.
Yeah. So I highly suggest using Etym Online just to find out word derivation. And sometimes you can find earlier versions of the word that you could use instead.
Which would help you. Because if it's a word, like if it's a word that was, okay, go ahead. If it was a word that is common today, and you're like, it just doesn't fit, look up I can't say the word because I apparently do the study of insects when I say it.
Etymology.
Etymology. I always want to say like with the T, but etymology.
It is ETYMOLOG. So Charlotte asks, are we for or against new spellings for common words?
I'm kind of for it if it's clear of what word, because when you start playing with go ahead, buddy. When you start playing with words, sometimes, and I noticed this, if anybody plays the game where, I forget, the Words with Friends or something, not that. It's where you find, it's like a circle of letters and you have to find as many different word combinations as possible.
Words with Friends has that as a bonus game.
Okay. When I'm playing that, sometimes I will like overpronounce the word, and I'm going I-T-E. Oh no, the word is 8. Why am I saying I-T-E? Like, and it's that overpronunciation mindset. So we got to be cautious about that when we're creating new spelling words, because whoever's reading it, like so many times I'm reading and it's somebody's name and I'm just like, Jim. I just make up my own and I substitute, and that's Jim for the rest of the book.
I have a confession to make about fantasy names. I don't know how to pronounce 90% of them. As I said, I'm a very conceptual imagination. I'm just like, this is the one that starts with a J. It's about this long. And in my head, they have a flavor and a personality and all those things. So I just see that and I know it represents this bucket of person in my head, but I don't bother figuring out how to pronounce it.
Why not? That's pretty much me. I bake up like, and I kind of like the idea of putting a flavor to the name, and everything, because it's interesting. I kind of like that.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons the almost rule came into being of don't have multiple people with the same first two letters of their name and the same number of syllables, because
or even the first letter and the last name. I know that is a rule, and I critiqued someone's work, and it was, the names were Jack, and the other one was a J name, and I totally forget what it might have been, Jared or something like that. And even though they weren't exact, I kept on getting them confused, which is weird because one is a lawyer in the story, and the other one is this gold digger ex-stepdad of the character. So I didn't need to confuse those two.
Yeah. So the ways they suggest are switch up the number of syllables, and also switch up what letter things start with. For me, for new spellings of common words, I would do it in more than one word, but not more than 3, I think, because you want it to be like, this is intentional, but if you just do it for one word, it looks weird.
Yeah.
So I would do it for a couple, but not so many that people would struggle to read it. It's the same thing I would suggest for dialects as well. Maybe replace 1 or 2 words, but not more than that.
I would say more than one, because, like, for example, let's take the word check. There's check, like CH. Yeah. I would say focus on the sound. So the British spelling of check with the QUE, if that's going to be your sound for the K sound, put QUE in other words to show consistency that it was actually on purpose. Otherwise, your person's going to read the book and be like, I thought this was in like today or something. Like, it's going to throw them off. So if you use, like you said, 2 or 3, but not every word, that will show on purpose.
Yes. You want to show intent, but you don't want to sacrifice readability.
Yes, because you're going to get readers like me that will just go Jim and move on.
So yeah, that's definitely. JD asks if we approve of the use of poetry, yay, nay, or depends.
So now me personally, I was even reading something the other day where it had singing in the background, which to me singing is kind of like poetry, in a way, especially on the written form. Even though the author says the person singing, you have lyrics on a page, I skim over it. I barely read it because I want to get to the story personally. Now, unless there's something like I like it better when a line is pulled. Like you said, this person is singing, and then the main character hears a line that sticks with them and it's pertinent to the story. That's when I like it.
I love putting music in my writing. In one of mine, I use poetry for some of the spell casting, because she uses her breath to do her spells, and so therefore, words matter a lot when she uses them. And I also have like a background character that like sings when he cooks, and it's just part of his personality, and so you get like the chorus or something in there.
Yeah. So, now what I was referring to was like 2 paragraphs long and like 8 lines per paragraph, and that's when I was like, that's too much. So but the way you talk about, if you get a chorus, especially if it's kind of well known, or maybe they're making up their own and I'm putting the bacon into the pan and stuff, then that's like a quirky character trait, and I love it.
Right. And in my middle grade one, her sister's in town visiting, and she hasn't seen her in months, and they start singing the chorus of a school play she was in when she was a kid, and it's a school play story. So I have the story of the corduroy bear.
Oh, I love that growing up.
Right?
I remember the story. He kept on getting lost in the mall. That was the one that I kept on rereading as a kid.
That's actually why I hated Paddington. I would see it coming on, and I would think it was corduroy, and it wasn't corduroy, and I was just mad, and I never wanted to try marmalade because it wasn't the corduroy bear.
Yeah.
Very resentful, very resentful.
So poetry in small doses, I think.
Yeah, I don't mind it if it's like a verse, like before a chapter kind of thing, or a theme that's quoted throughout the story, or something that ties in, but I wouldn't do more than like 4 lines in a row. If you have the whole song, pull a Mercedes Lackey, put it in the appendix. But, I know a lot of fantasy writers who are filkers, who write their own songs to go with their stuff, and it's awesome. But don't have it in. You can have it in the appendix. You can have it on a like CD or however music is released these days.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't include the entire lyrics in the thing unless you have something else going on that pulls it together with the story.
Then if you are, like you said, have something else. So like have like the first verse, and then maybe an action happens in the story.
Right.
Like it's the characters seeing each other. It's their meet cute. They're seeing each other across the room and stuff. And then the chorus happens and more action happens. Like, so it kind of seems simultaneously. Yeah, sure. We'll go with that.
The same way you would do with any sort of backstory or description. Filter it in, don't dump it and leave it.
Yes.
If you have more than 2 paragraphs of description or even action, you want to break it up with dialogue or something, or description or something else. You don't want more than 2 paragraphs of anything without something interspersed in there. I think is a pretty decent rule of thumb. Definitely. And of course, when you're writing, you can write 5 pages of action, but then go back and edit. My favorite action rant is, I think, the start of Matrix 2, where there's a 30-minute fight scene that it starts off with. And I have a super low bar for excitement. I was on the edge of my seat for the first 5 minutes, for the first 10 minutes. And then I sat back a little. And by 20 minutes, I was just leaning back in my chair, wondering when we were going to move on with the plot, because we were just fighting. So you want to make sure that it's not just a chunk of one thing. Yeah. But that's a general writing tip, not necessarily.
It's not moderation. It's moderation. There we go. That's the word.
Yes.
We want to moderate and like think of all information, action, dialogue as a trickle, not as fire hose.
Right. Or data dump or what have you.
Yeah. So definitely, I definitely agree with that. Oh, we got Charlotte Creates has a comment here.
Yep.
Okay, so I have a question. My work in progress was originally contemporary and has recently become fantasy. Don't you love it when that happens? Just like randomly changes up on you.
100%.
What are things to look out for when making it most cohesive as a novel? Is modern fantasy a genre?
100%. It varies. It could be contemporary fantasy. It could be fantabulism. It could be magical realism. There are a lot of little nuancy subgenres based on the type of magic. And if it's innate, there's urban fantasy, which is clearly contemporary fantasy. So modern fantasy does have some tropes. It depends on what sort of magic. Is it just a background sort of thing that happens? Do they bake and then people fall in love? Hello, Simply Irresistible. How integrated in the world is the magic? Is it a one-off, or is it, just a part of the culture? So that's definitely something you're going to want to think about. But for making it cohesive, just follow it through. If there's this magical element, it's going to impact other things. And so, you know,
I think one thing when you're editing and going back, one thing that will probably stand out to you after you set it aside for a little bit and then read it, because I still think that's important, because I didn't do it and I should have.
Oh no!
But the is you probably started incorporating the magic piece like after it was established as contemporary before. So you got this large chunk of like no magic. And so it's going to be drawing to the reader. So maybe put in some foreshadowing that the MC brushes off as, oh, that's coincidence or something at the beginning, and then it turns into magic later. Because otherwise, it's missing from the beginning. They're not going to see it. So that would be my suggestion to help make it cohesive. When you go back to editing, finish the rest of it. Don't worry about going to the front now. because you might have this great idea, but finish the rest of it.
Yeah. Charlotte says her character is a demon. So I'm reminded of Harry Potter, and before he finds out he's a wizard, he hears the snake talking to him. And that even sets up the whole parcel tongue thing that comes in later. You know, the Harry Potter written by she who will not be named. Totally came out of the ether. But so we really are at time now, though. So let's go ahead and give our outros. Go ahead.
All right. I am Natalie Locke. I post videos every Tuesday. Today I am a jester, not because I talk with my hands.
That's a mime.
For me, it's both. I'm bilingual then. I talk while I mime. But I post videos every Tuesday. I'm going through Wordy, and I just like to be here. I'm the token person that has no clue what they're doing. So I ask the questions that everyone else is probably too afraid to ask.
And thank you for coming. This is my channel. I'm Morgan Hazelwood. I am an unpublished, or as I've been told, pre-published fantasy writer. I am also a blogger, vlogger, podcaster, and social media addict. You can find me everywhere as Morgan Hazelwood. Obviously here, youtube.com/Morgan Hazelwood, morganhazelwood.com, morganhazelwood.fireside.fm for my podcast. And this week on Thursdays is when my vlog goes up. This week I talked about spirits abroad and at home, talking about spirits in other cultures and non-Western ones and how they do. And tomorrow I will be back here at 5 p.m. for the Virtual Writing Renaissance Faire word sprints, and then I'll be back on my own at 8 p.m. for my Preptober world building event. My friend Doc is going to be joining me, so that should be a lot of fun. And the next Virtual Renaissance Faire is Books by Adrian at 11 Eastern Daylight Time. So definitely tune in. Thank you all for joining me. It was a great discussion. Thank you, Natalie. And I'll see you around. Bye.
Bye.